You've probably seen the headlines, right? A lot of talk about India's economy, words like slowdown, even some whispers of a crash. So what is really going on? Let's dig into the data and figure it out together.
So, this is the phrase that's been getting thrown around. A planned crash. It sounds pretty dramatic, doesn't it? But what are we actually talking about here? Is the reality anywhere near as scary as the name suggests?
Okay, first things first. It's super important to know that planned crash is not some official economic term. Nope, it's really just a catchphrase that media and analysts started using to describe the slowdown in India's GDP growth that happened during the 2023-2024 fiscal year. All right, so let's move past the labels and get straight to the hard data. How big was this slowdown really? Let's size up the numbers and see what they tell us.
This chart pretty much tells the story in one glance. You see that first big bar, that huge 8.7% jump? That was the economy just roaring back to life after the pandemic. But then, look what happens. It starts to cool off, down to 7.6%, and then you see a more noticeable drop to 6.8% in the last fiscal year. That is the deceleration that everyone's been talking about.
But, and this is a huge but, you have to put that number in perspective. Context is everything. While 6.8% is definitely a slowdown for India, you have to realize most other major economies were barely growing at 2%. So, yeah, India's engine slowed down a bit, but it was still one of the fastest moving vehicles on the entire global highway.
Okay, so that's the what. Now for the really interesting part, the why. This is where we put on our detective hats and start looking for clues, both from around the world and right here at home.
So, let's start with the usual suspects, the global headwinds. You had central banks all over the world, especially the US Fed, jacking up interest rates to fight their own inflation problems. That makes money more expensive for everyone, everywhere. Throw in some very real fears of a recession in places like the US and Europe, plus wild swings in the prices of oil and other commodities, and you've got a perfect storm brewing right off India's coast.
Now, it wasn't all just external pressure. Things weren't exactly quiet on the home front either. Stubborn inflation was a real problem, basically eating away at how much people could buy. Because of that, India's own central bank, the RBI, had to step in and raise interest rates. Now, that's a move specifically designed to cool the economy down. And what was the result? Well, both regular people and big businesses started to pull back on spending.
And this shows you just how hard the RBI hit the brakes. They raised what's called the repo rate, that's the key interest rate, by 250 basis points. Now that might sound like a weird number, but it's just a fancy way of saying they increased it by a full 2.5%. That is a massive, deliberate move to get inflation under control, and it had the direct effect of slowing economic activity right down.
So, with the economy getting pulled in all these different directions, you have to wonder, how did policymakers even respond? Well, as you're about to see, it was a very delicate balancing act, a real tightrope walk. And here you see that classic tension perfectly. It's like one foot is on the brake and the other is on the accelerator. On one side, you've got the RBI using monetary policy, raising interest rates to cool things down and fight inflation. At the exact same time, you have the government using fiscal policy, spending more money on things like infrastructure and welfare to try and keep that growth engine humming. Two very different approaches for two very different goals.
The government strategy was really all about the long game. They were pumping money into building roads and ports, trying to make it easier for businesses to operate, and really putting a huge focus on making more stuff in India and selling it to the world. These are all things designed to build a much stronger foundation for the future. So, after looking at all the evidence, investigating the causes, and seeing how everyone responded, what's the final verdict? Was this really a planned crash?
Let's just ask the question directly. Was this a dramatic, terrifying crash that signals some deep, fundamental problem, or was it something else, maybe a necessary correction?
So let's break it down, side by side. The whole crash narrative, it's pretty hyperbolic, a bit over the top. It only focuses on the fact that the pace of growth slowed. The reality? A 6.8% growth rate is still incredibly strong. Plus, the slowdown was hugely influenced by global factors, and when you look at the whole picture, it looks way more like a necessary correction to fight inflation than some kind of catastrophic collapse.
And what's the outlook? Well, it's cautiously optimistic. The general consensus is that as inflation finally cools down and hopefully the global situation gets a little more stable, India's growth is expected to pick right back up again. The economy's core engine is still very, very solid. So the real takeaway here isn't just about one year's set of numbers. It actually leaves us with a much bigger, much more important question. In a world where these global shocks and surprises seem to be the new normal, the real challenge for India is this. How do you build an economy that's not just fast, but is also tough enough to take a punch? That's the real story to watch going forward.